Hello, everyone. I'm Alicia Malone. Welcome to night number one of TCM's very special look at the studio system. Today, we saw films made by Columbia Pictures, and now we turn our attention to one of the five major studios throughout the studio system, Warner Brothers. And to help me discuss the studio and our first film of the night, Dark Victory from 1939, I am joined virtually by film historian and author of the new book, Mike Nichols' A Life, Mark Harris. Hello.
Thanks so much. It's so much fun to be revisiting these movies with you.
And we also have the editor at large at The Hollywood Reporter and the host of KCRW's The Business, Kim Masters. Hi.
Oh, what a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I wanted to start by just setting up the idea of the studio system. So, Mark, this was kind of a factory mode of production that began in the 1920s and solidified at the end of that decade and then flourished throughout the 1930s and early 40s. And here, the five major studios that were in power, they really controlled every part of movie making, didn't they? From development right through to exhibition.
That's right. Nowadays, we often think of the director or sometimes the producer as the power behind any movie. But in the era that we're talking about, if you were a director, a writer, or an actor, chances are that you were under a long-term contract to that studio. And when a director was making a movie, it was the studio that often dictated everything from the star that was going to be used, to the choice of cinematographer, to the music, to the art direction.
Yeah, and then the studios also owned the theaters, which, Kim, it's a very different process today. The studios no longer develop all of their films in-house, but they are mainly distributors, aren't they?
Well, we're in the midst of a very dramatic moment in Hollywood where the studios are really the legacy studios like Warner Brothers that are facing this enormous challenge from the streamers. So, what they are becoming is something that we have to wait and see. Uh, what we are seeing is a lot of movies that normally would have gone into theaters are moving to streaming. And we're at a moment in history where the question is, can theaters survive this combination of a pandemic and the digital revolution that is driving all of these companies, and Warner's first among them at this moment, Warner's, which made this movie, driving all of this to their streaming platforms. And this is transforming the business in ways that we can't even anticipate in terms of where is the power going to lie, what kind of deals are people going to get? We are just at a moment of revolution.
Yes, and we do want to point out that TCM is part of Warner Media. Now, Mark, let's talk about Warner Brothers, founded in 1923 by these four Polish Warner Brothers. They acquired First National Pictures 2 years later and a theatre chain. And they were one of the early adopters of sound films, weren't they? Which really put them in that prime position at the end of the 20s.
That's right. I mean, Warner Brothers wasn't the most glamorous studio, or by some measures, the most powerful studio. I think most people would say that was MGM. But Warner Brothers was kind of the most upstart studio. They had the biggest young stars. They did gangster movies. They did urban movies. They were sort of seen to be a little more daring, maybe, than the other traditional studios. And like all studios back then, they had a pretty substantial office in New York that was charged with scouting both new novels, because the whole publishing industry was in New York, and new plays. And Dark Victory, the movie we're talking about tonight, was one of those properties. It had been a Broadway play in 1934 with Tallulah Bankhead.
I mean, I'll just jump in, if I may, and say that Warner's became the opposite of an upstart and had been until very recently the legacy Tiffany studio, the one that was most talent friendly and making these big movies that now we're at a moment where it is pivoting so sharply again. So just to reiterate, what a dramatic moment in history this is.
Yeah, it's so interesting to look back at the way that the studio began. And, Mark, you talk about Dark Victory being a play. And, really, Betty Davis, who stars in this film, was the force behind getting this made, wasn't she? Because it was originally owned by David O. Selznick, who was going to make it at MGM and then as an independent producer. But once Betty Davis decided she wanted to star in this film, she was set out to convince Hal Wallace and Jack Warner.
That's right. I mean, every actress of note in Hollywood wanted this part, but Betty Davis, who was Warner Brothers' really biggest actress at the time, decided that she wanted it and really pursued it. And what's interesting is that came after a really brutal battle between Betty Davis and Warner Brothers. She had been taken to court for breach of contract because she was protesting against what she thought was the second rate nature of the acting assignments that the studio was giving her. And they took her to court and she lost. But she made her point and she started getting better projects and a little more control than she had had over the choice of them. And Dark Victory was a movie she really, really wanted to do.
Well, we'll talk more about the film afterwards, but right now, here it is, Dark Victory. Back with me to talk more about Dark Victory, Betty Davis, and the history of Warner Brothers. I'm joined once again by the editor-at-large at The Hollywood Reporter, Kim Masters, and film historian Mark Harris. And Mark, you know, this was a film made in 1939, a woman's picture, which of course meant that this very independent woman had to die in the end.
Right. I look at that last scene and Betty Davis, one funny thing about her was that she really hated having her big dramatic scenes overscored. And she was always worried that whatever she was doing would be drowned out by music. So she said to the director of Dark Victory, Edmund Goulding, when it came time to film her very dramatic walk up the staircase to her deathbed, she said, "All right, tell me right now, am I going up the stairs with music or not? Because either I'm walking up the stairs or Max Steiner is walking up the stairs, but we're not going to do it together."
I love that. And I think it just points out just how powerful and forceful Betty Davis was. I mean, she called herself a legendary terror and she could be difficult, but she had this incredible longevity in her career, kept making comebacks in films like All About Eve in 1950 and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane in 1962. And she kept working up till the 1980s, which for Hollywood, being notoriously ageist and sexist, was quite rare.
Yeah, and in 1939, there was no way that Jack Warner was going to allow Betty Davis or any star into the editing room. So she really had to develop kind of impressive survival skills early on in terms of looking out for herself and looking out for her performance and making sure that she could control whatever she could control, because there was so much that no actor had any say in back then.
Yeah, and Kim, when we look at the longevity of female stars in general in Hollywood, you do get a couple of these women who have incredibly long careers, and they seem to tend to be similar to Betty Davis in that they're not afraid of playing a variety of roles.
Yeah, you see somebody like Helen Mirren or Meryl Streep, where there's a character beyond just a beauty. It's not that like Betty Davis was a conventional beauty. And I think the actresses who go on to these long lasting careers have the guts and the willingness to be villains or play unattractive roles and stretch and have that character that shines through.
Yeah, as Betty Davis said, the villains often have the best parts, so she didn't mind playing a villain. And so, Kim, I want to talk more about Warner Media today and exactly where it's going with the future, and also want to point out that TCM is part of Warner Media. And so with their big releases now playing also on HBO Max the same day as in theaters, what do you think that means for the future?
I think it's a huge question. I mean, they did this without really telling the filmmakers who made these movies or their representatives or their partners. And as we are speaking, there's just a shock going through the industry. It's an irony that the legacy studio that had been seen as the most stable and traditional of the studios is now so aggressively leading the charge into an unknown future where This is something that had been very much resisted by theater owners. They're already in desperate trouble because of the pandemic. We do have a vaccine on the horizon, and I'm sure they were hoping that theaters would then start to reopen in the spring. And along comes Warner and says, we're putting these movies on the streaming service. And, even if you present it as a temporary measure, the fact is it's really going to be hard to put the genie back in the bottle. And we're going to see a potential world where independent film in particular struggles because if they're outside of the streaming world, artists like to see their movies on the big screen. And the question is, where will the big screens be found?
Yeah, and usually you would get some kind of separation, wouldn't you, Mark, between the blockbusters that would play in theaters and the smaller films that would play on the streaming services. But now we're going to have much bigger films on the streaming services.
Yeah, I mean, we're moving into an era, I think, in which the people who finance movies, if not the people who actually direct and produce and star in them, are kind of saying loud and clear, we don't really care about the delivery system. We don't care if you go to a movie theater or stream it on a big TV screen or stream it on a small laptop screen. We just want you to see it. And that is certainly going to have a really profound effect on the movie industry. It's been a couple of years coming, but it really seems now to be happening all at once.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And we'll have more to talk about with Warner Brothers after the break. So, Mark Harris, Kim Masters, stay with us because coming up, we have Humphrey Bogart in a very iconic role, starring in a quintessential film noir.